Before we begin, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Thank you. The Critian ambassador regarded the human delegation the way someone might look at a person who had just cheerfully offered to step into a burning star. Lieutenant Owen Reed couldn't determine whether the alien's expression leaned toward admiration or something closer to grief. "Do you truly comprehend what you are proposing?" Ambassador Thelkin asked, his throat sacs fluttering with what Owen's translation unit identified as profound distress. The Void Latis has swallowed 43 expeditions in the last cycle alone. Not turned them back, not defeated them, swallowed them. Ships, crews, every record of their existence. The space itself is fundamentally wrong in that region. It is hostile to the very notion of being. Captain Nathan Cross, seated to Owen's left, wore that particular expression Owen had come to associate with catastrophically poor decisions being made with absolute certainty. "We've gone through the reports, Ambassador, and you still wish to continue." "Wish is perhaps too strong a word," Nathan replied. "But yes, we'll accept the contract." The room went silent. Even the Critian delegation's translation unit seemed to pause before converting Nathan's words into their clicking harmonic tongue. Around the table, representatives from 6 distinct species fixed their eyes on the 3 humans with expressions spanning from open disbelief to what might have been the alien equivalent of waiting for a punchline. Owen understood their reaction entirely. The mission briefing had been comprehensive, thorough, and utterly horrifying. The Void Latis was a region of space roughly 6 light-years in diameter that had materialized without warning in the Turs sector 18 months prior. It did not behave according to any recognized model of spatial physics. Ships that entered reported time dilation, dimensional destabilization, and what the scientific documentation diplomatically referred to as aggressive reality degradation. The first expedition had been a Critian science vessel crewed by 40 individuals. They had entered the lattice transmitting updates at 10-second intervals. Those transmissions had continued for approximately 3 minutes before terminating without warning. Recovery teams sent to investigate had found absolutely nothing. No wreckage, no residual energy, no trace that a vessel had ever been there at all. The pattern had repeated itself 42 more times. Different species, different technologies, different tactical approaches. Every mission had ended identically, complete and total erasure. The Galactic Council had classified the Void Latis as a Level 9 hazard zone and established quarantine protocols to prevent further loss of life. But there was a problem that quarantine alone could not solve. The lattice was growing, slowly, measurably, steadily. It was expanding outward, consuming more space with each passing month, threatening shipping corridors and inhabited systems that could not simply be abandoned. Someone needed to enter and determine how to stop it, or at minimum understand what it actually was. The Council had issued a call for volunteers among its member species, offering substantial compensation and permanent recognition to anyone sufficiently brave or desperate to attempt the mission. The response had been deeply underwhelming. Several military units had stepped forward out of duty. A handful of scientific teams had expressed curiosity of the morbid variety. But once the actual mission parameters had been explained in full detail, most had quietly withdrawn their names from consideration. Humanity, having joined the Galactic Council only 8 months earlier, had been conspicuously absent from the initial volunteer roster. This had surprised precisely no one. Humans were newcomers to galactic affairs, still navigating the early stages of interstellar diplomacy, and had generally kept their distance from high-risk council business, which made their sudden appearance at the mission briefing all the more startling. "I must ask," Ambassador Thelkin continued, his voice shifting into the formal cadence reserved for official record, "have you fully considered that this mission carries a statistical survival probability of exactly 0%? That is not rhetorical exaggeration. Every single expedition has been lost. Every single crew has vanished. There is no rational basis for believing your outcome would be any different." "That's because everyone has been going about it the wrong way," said the third human at the table, a solidly built man named Kevin, who served as the team's technical specialist. His tone was perfectly matter-of-fact, as though he were addressing a minor calibration issue rather than a cosmic phenomenon responsible for thousands of deaths. "You've all been treating it as a natural event to be studied, something to approach with caution, with scientific methodology, with proper safeguards. Is it not?" asked Velshara, the Altarian science minister, her crystalline features catching the briefing room's harsh illumination in patterns that conveyed genuine inquiry. Kevin shrugged. Maybe, but based on everything in your data, it behaves less like a natural formation and more like an immune response. It's reactive, it's adaptive, and it only escalates when something enters it carrying the wrong posture, for lack of a better term. You cannot possibly derive that conclusion from sensor logs alone, Velshara objected. The data is fragmentary and contradictory in multiple places. It shows a consistent pattern, Nathan interjected gently, once you stop searching for purely scientific explanations and start treating it as something that responds. Every single expedition that went in was either heavily armed, extensively shielded, or both. They entered expecting conflict, and the Latis provided exactly that. They were trying to protect themselves, and the Latis interpreted that posture as aggression. The silence that followed was distinctly different from the earlier skepticism. This was the quiet of intelligent minds encountering an idea that was simultaneously self-evident and inconceivable. You're suggesting, Ambassador Thelkin said slowly, that the Void Latis is conscious. We're suggesting, Owen said, speaking for the first time, that whether it's conscious or not may be beside the point. What matters is that it responds to intent. Everything that has entered it was either afraid of it, hostile toward it, or attempting to overpower it. So we intend to try something different. Nathan's expression shifted slightly. We're going to walk through it like it isn't even there. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Several delegates began speaking simultaneously, their translation units generating a cacophony of objections, protests, and what Owen was reasonably certain amounted to accusations of insanity in at least 3 separate languages. Ambassador Thelkin raised a hand and the room quieted. He leaned forward, his bearing radiating what the cultural briefing had described as a senior figure's concern for a dangerously inexperienced one. Explain, he said simply. Nathan exchanged a glance with Owen and Kevin, some unspoken understanding passing between them. Then he faced the assembled delegates and began laying out their plan. By any reasonable metric, it was completely insane. They would use a single vessel. Not a warship or a heavily armored science craft, but a standard transport shuttle with minimal modifications. No weapons, no defensive systems beyond what basic navigation demanded. They would enter the Void Latis without shields, without armor, transmitting their presence openly, rather than attempting concealment or protection. You'll be dead within seconds, Velshara stated flatly. Possibly, Nathan agreed. But every other method has failed. Our read of the data suggests the Latis is far less inherently dangerous than everyone assumes. It's responding to perceived threats. If we enter without projecting that threat, without the aggressive posture every previous expedition has carried, we may be able to pass through. And if you're mistaken, Owen added, then we die quickly rather than slowly. But we don't believe we're mistaken. The debate stretched on for another hour. Delegates raised objections ranging from practical equipment concerns to philosophical arguments about whether voluntarily disabling one's defenses amounted to a form of deliberate self-destruction. But ultimately the arithmetic was mercilessly simple. Every previous approach had failed. The Latis was still expanding. And the humans were offering to try something no one else had attempted. The Council approved the mission by a vote that Ambassador Thelkin later described as reluctant surrender to the reality of human stubbornness. That had been 3 days ago. Now Owen stood in the docking bay of the Council station, watching as Kevin ran final checks on their shuttle. The lucky fool was precisely what had been promised. A basic transport craft with stripped-down systems, enough life support for 2 weeks, and navigation equipment capable of plotting a course through the Latis, assuming they survived long enough to need one. You know this is insane, Owen said. Not for the first time. Completely, Kevin replied without lifting his eyes from his console, but insane happens to be something of a specialty for us. Nathan emerged from the shuttle's small cargo bay, carrying 3 standard-issue pressure suits and a duffel bag that clinked when he set it down. Final supplies are loaded. We're ready whenever you are. Owen studied his 2 companions and wondered, as he had done more than once in recent weeks, how exactly he had ended up here. 3 months earlier, he had been a shuttle pilot for the Terran Colonial Service, running supply routes between Earth's outer settlements and earning just enough to keep his ship fueled and his accounts barely in the black. Then Nathan had appeared with a job offer that sounded implausible from the first sentence. join a small private team doing specialized consulting for alien clients. With compensation roughly 10 times what he was making hauling cargo between settlements, the catch, Owen had assumed, would eventually reveal itself. It always did. The catch, as it turned out, was that specialized consulting meant accepting jobs that were too dangerous, too strange, or too legally ambiguous for anyone else to consider. Their first mission had involved recovering stolen data from a pirate installation. Their second had been escorting a slain diplomat through genuinely hostile territory. Their third had been investigating reports of ghost ships in the Outer Rim. All of them had been dangerous. All of them had paid extremely well. And all of them had left Owen with the steadily strengthening conviction that Nathan was either the luckiest individual in the galaxy or genuinely unhinged. Quite possibly both. "Final checks?" Nathan announced, his tone shifting into the clipped professionalism that marked the transition from preparation to execution. "Kevin, systems status, all green. Minimal shielding online. Life support running at maximum efficiency. Navigation database loaded with every fragment of data we could pull from previous expeditions. Owen. Flight systems DOS, controls ready. I've plotted 3 possible approach routes through the lattice based on the entry points previous teams used. If we make it through the initial penetration, I can adjust our heading in real time." "Good," Nathan paused. "Remember, the goal isn't to fight and it isn't to evade. It's to accept. Whatever happens in there, we don't panic. We don't respond with aggression. And we don't try to outwit something that has already outwitted everyone else. Walk through it like it isn't even there," Owen repeated, attempting to load his voice with more confidence than he actually possessed. "Exactly." They boarded the Lucky Fool without further conversation, each of them moving with the practiced economy of people who had worked together long enough to develop a shared rhythm. Owen settled into the pilot's seat. Kevin took the engineering station. Nathan positioned himself at navigation. The council had provided them a departure window that would route them directly to the Latis's nearest boundary, a courtesy that felt uncomfortably like a funeral escort. As Owen powered up the engines and requested departure clearance, he could see Council Station's observation deck illuminating with dozens of silhouetted figures, all of them gathering to witness the humans' departure. To watch them die, more likely. "Control. This is Lucky Fool requesting clearance for departure," Owen transmitted. "Lucky Fool, you are cleared for departure. Maintaining safe distance until you clear the station perimeter." A pause. "Good luck. May your journey be swift. Thanks. Control. Lucky Fool out." The shuttle eased away from the station with the quiet grace of a vessel that had not yet been informed of how catastrophically poor its prospects were. Behind them, Owen knew, tracking sensors were recording every detail of their departure, logging each moment for later analysis following their inevitable disappearance. The journey to the lattice boundary took 6 hours at standard acceleration. They spent the time in relative quiet, each managing their pre-mission tension in their own fashion. Kevin ran diagnostics on systems that had already been verified 3 times over. Nathan reviewed the fragmented data from previous expeditions, searching for patterns that might improve their odds of surviving the next several minutes. Owen simply flew, letting the familiar cadence of the controls steady his thoughts. As they neared the lattice boundary, the shuttle's sensors began registering anomalies. Space itself seemed to waver at the periphery of perception, as though reality were becoming less certain the closer they approached. The visual display showed what appeared to be an immense curtain of distorted luminescence, colors that had no business existing, cascading across the viewscreen in configurations that made Owen's eyes ache if he looked too directly at them. "Entering sensor range of the boundary," Kevin announced. "Energy readings are, I don't even have a framework for what I'm seeing. Every spectrum is showing activity, but none of it aligns with any known physics." "Does it read as hostile?" Nathan asked. "It reads as alive. I can understand why previous teams interpreted it as an attack. It's reaching outward, testing things, probing. And if we don't push back..." Kevin was quiet for a moment, studying his instruments. "Then maybe it doesn't push us." Owen drew a slow breath and adjusted their heading, pointing the Lucky Fool directly at the center of the boundary region. "Last chance to reconsider," he said, hating the slight tremor in his own voice. "Keep going," Nathan said quietly. The shuttle crossed the boundary at exactly 1847 hours station time. For a moment, nothing happened at all. The Latis simply enveloped them, its impossible colors flooding the viewscreen with patterns that made Owen's head swim. He kept his hands steady on the controls, held their course, and tried very deliberately not to think about the 43 expeditions that had ceased to exist in precisely this situation. Then the ship began to change. It wasn't damaged, not exactly. Nothing was failing or breaking down, but Owen could feel the lucky fool becoming something different beneath his hands. The controls retained their physical form, every switch and panel remaining exactly where it had always been, but they felt strange and unfamiliar, as though they were learning to be something else. "Is anyone else experiencing this?" he asked. "Yes," Kevin breathed. "It's like the ship is remembering a different way to exist." "Stay calm," Nathan ordered. "Don't fight it. Let it happen." The Latis pressed inward around them, and Owen suddenly understood, with a clarity that was almost painful, what the previous expeditions had felt in their final moments. The Latis wasn't hostile. It was curious. It was examining them, probing them, attempting to determine what they were and what they intended. And if they met that examination with fear or resistance, it would respond accordingly. Owen forced his breathing to slow, forced his hands to remain relaxed on the controls, forced himself to allow what was happening rather than fight against it. Beside him, he could hear Kevin and Nathan doing the same, their breathing gradually synchronizing into something that felt almost meditative. The ship continued to transform around them. The walls appeared to become transparent, offering glimpses of other locations, other moments in time. Owen watched a Cridian warship being dismantled at the molecular level, its crew dissolving silently into their component atoms. He watched a Selene science vessel locked in temporal stasis, while its crew aged decades in mere seconds. He saw vessels belonging to species he didn't recognize, all of them dying in ways that suggested the Latis had identified precisely what each crew feared most, and delivered it without hesitation. But the lucky fool was not dying. It was transforming. "Navigation," Nathan said, his voice distant and strange. "Owen, I need you to plot a new course." Owen checked his instruments and found them displaying information that should not have been possible, coordinates that existed in more spatial dimensions than physics should permit. A route that led not around the Latis, but directly through it, following pathways that his equipment assured him were completely navigable, despite being physically impossible. He plotted the course because there was nothing else to do. Because refusing would mean resistance, and resistance would mean death, and death would mean becoming just one more name on the Council's growing list of the lost. The lucky fool followed the impossible route with an ease that made no sense whatsoever. They traveled through spaces that existed in the gaps between spaces, navigating corridors of warped reality that should have torn them apart, but instead seemed to receive them. The journey lasted minutes or hours or days. Time itself had become negotiable inside the Latis, and Owen found he could no longer clearly recall how long they had been flying. Then, without ceremony, they were through. The Latis released them into normal space with a sensation like breaking the surface of deep water. After holding your breath far too long, Owen gasped, suddenly aware he had not been breathing. His instruments snapped back to familiar configurations, showing readings that made sense again. Behind them, the lattice boundary shimmered and settled, looking for all the world like nothing more than an unusually dense nebula. "Status report," Nathan said, his voice rough as if he hadn't spoken in days. "We're alive," Kevin said, sounding genuinely astonished by the fact. "All systems nominal. We're on the far side of the lattice, approximately 6.3 light-years from our entry point." "That's impossible," Owen muttered. "That transit should have taken days at maximum burn." "Welcome to the Void Latis," Nathan replied, "where physics operates as more of a general suggestion than a hard rule." They drifted without speaking for several minutes, each of them working through the reality of what had just occurred. They had accomplished what 43 expeditions before them had failed to do. They had entered the Void Latis and survived. More than survived, they had crossed it entirely, covering 6 light-years of space in less time than it should take to travel 6 million kilometers. "This is going to change everything," Kevin said softly. Nathan nodded. "If we can teach others to do what we did, if we can translate what we learned in there into something others can follow." "Can we?" Owen asked. "Because I'm genuinely not certain I understand what happened." "We stopped fighting," Nathan said simply. "That's the whole of it. Every expedition before us entered trying to conquer the lattice, or study it, or survive it. We simply let it be what it was. And it let us pass." Owen wanted to argue that it couldn't possibly be that straightforward, but the evidence was impossible to refute. They were alive. They were through. They had demonstrated that the Void Latis was not an impenetrable barrier, it was a test. And humanity had apparently just passed it. Control is going to completely lose composure, Kevin observed. We should probably notify them we're still breathing before they begin drafting our memorial. Owen reached for the communications panel and then hesitated. What exactly do we tell them? Nathan considered the question. The truth. That it isn't about technology or weapons or defensive systems. It's about approach. About intention. About being willing to accept something rather than fighting it. They won't believe us. Probably not, Nathan agreed. But the data will make the case on its own. We made it through. That's sufficient proof to begin with. Owen opened the channel and began transmitting their status report. As he spoke, choosing words that described their transit through the lattice, without quite capturing how profoundly strange the experience had been, he could almost hear the disbelief in the silence that followed his transmission. Then, Control responded, and Owen heard something in the operator's voice that he had not expected. Hope. Lucky fool? Confirm your position. Are you stating that you successfully traversed the Void Latis? Confirmed, Control. We are on the far side of the anomaly, all crew alive and unharmed. Ship systems nominal. Another pause, longer this time. When Control responded, multiple voices were audible in the background, a barely contained storm of excited discussion straining against professional protocol. Lucky fool, maintain your current position. Multiple vessels are being dispatched to your coordinates for confirmation and debrief. Estimated arrival, 8 hours. Understood, Control. We'll be here. The channel closed, leaving the three humans alone in the quiet of the shuttle's cabin. Beyond the viewport, stars that had been unreachable hours ago now spread before them in all directions. Entire sectors of space suddenly accessible, thanks to the passage they had just discovered. 8 hours, Kevin said. What do we do until then? Nathan smiled. That familiar expression of someone who had just done something impossible and was already thinking about the next one. We document everything we can recall. Every sensation, every reading, every moment of the transit. Because we're going to need to teach others how to do this, and we'll have to be very precise about it. Unframble, unblur. They spent those hours meticulously reconstructing their experiences, comparing impressions, and attempting to convert subjective sensations into objective data. It proved harder than Owen had anticipated. How did you describe the feeling of space rebuilding itself around you? How did you quantify the experience of allowing reality to come apart without surrendering to panic? The Council vessels arrived exactly 8 hours later, a modest fleet, representing half a dozen species, approaching the Lucky Fool with what Owen interpreted as extraordinary caution, as though they suspected the humans might have contracted something contagious. Ambassador Thelkan was aboard the lead ship. His face on the comm screen wore an expression that Owen's cultural training couldn't quite classify. Something caught between amazement and the particular exhaustion that arrives when one's most fundamental assumptions about reality are proven wrong. You survived, the ambassador said, as if he still couldn't quite accept it. We did more than survive, Nathan replied. We found a way through, and we can teach others to do the same. Honorangulmars. The debrief that followed consumed 3 full days. They were transferred to a Council research vessel and subjected to every scan, interview, and psychological evaluation that 6 different species could devise. Medical teams examined them for signs of temporal displacement, dimensional contamination, and exotic radiation exposure. Scientists interrogated them about every detail of their transit, searching for some technological explanation that might account for their survival. What they found was simultaneously disappointing and extraordinary. There was no trick, no specialized equipment, no hidden technique. The humans had simply approached the lattice differently than anyone else had been willing to try. It's as much a matter of psychology as physics. Nathan explained during one of the scientific briefings. The lattice responds to intent. When you enter expecting a fight, expecting death, trying to shield yourself from harm, it interprets that posture as aggression and responds in kind. But if you enter accepting the lattice for what it is, without resistance or fear, it allows passage. That is a deeply unsatisfying explanation, Velshera declared. The Altarian scientist had been assigned to lead the investigation, and she made no effort to conceal her skepticism. You're proposing that a cosmic phenomenon possesses psychological awareness. that it evaluates intent. I'm proposing that it responds to intent, Nathan corrected. Whether it has awareness in any meaningful philosophical sense, I genuinely couldn't say, but the pattern is undeniable. Aggression produces destruction. Acceptance produces passage, and you expect others to replicate your success based on this philosophy. We expect others to try, Nathan said calmly, because the alternative is surrendering entire sectors of space to a phenomenon that doesn't need to remain impassable. The scientific community remained deeply skeptical, but the council could not dismiss the evidence. The humans had survived where everyone else had perished. More critically, their sensor logs contained clear recordings of the route they had taken, a path through the lattice that could theoretically be followed by any crew capable of sustaining the required mental state. A second expedition was organized within a week. A volunteer crew of Critian scientists, coached extensively by Nathan on the principles of acceptance over resistance, prepared to attempt the crossing themselves. Owen watched the preparations with mixed feelings he couldn't fully articulate. He wanted them to succeed. He needed their discovery to be reproducible. But he couldn't entirely shake the suspicion that they were missing something essential, some quality of their own success. The success couldn't be explained or replicated through instruction alone. The Critian team entered the Latis 3 days later. Their transmissions lasted approximately 2 minutes before cutting off entirely. Just as every failed expedition before them had done, they never emerged on the far side. The news hit Owen harder than he expected. He had never met that crew personally, but the knowledge that his advice had effectively guided them to their deaths settled into his chest like something cold and heavy. Nathan received it with more analytical distance, treating it as data rather than tragedy. But even he seemed subdued in the days that followed. It wasn't their fault, Kevin said during one of their private discussions. They followed every instruction we gave them. Minimal shielding, non-aggressive posture, open acceptance of the lattice's nature. Then why did they die? Owen asked. Because knowing the correct approach in your mind isn't sufficient, Nathan said quietly. You have to feel it. You have to genuinely be unafraid. Genuinely accept what's happening. The Critians attempted it, but they entered knowing they might die. That expectation, that underlying fear, the lattice sensed it and reacted. So only people who don't value their own lives can make it through. No, Nathan said firmly. Only people who can genuinely accept death as a real possibility without allowing that acceptance to become paralysis or panic. There's a meaningful difference. Owen sat with that for a long time. He thought back to the crossing, to the moment when he had stopped resisting the lattice's transformations and simply allowed them to occur. It hadn't been indifference to his own survival. It had been the recognition that his fear was irrelevant to the situation, that fighting would accomplish nothing except guaranteeing the outcome he was afraid of. It was a distinctly human form of acceptance, the capacity to face something genuinely terrifying and determine that terror itself was the true enemy, not the thing producing it. We need to try again, Nathan announced during a meeting with Ambassador Thelkan 3 days later. But this time we bring someone along with us. Us. Someone from another species, who can learn the method through direct experience rather than instruction. The ambassador's throat sacs pulsed with what Owen had learned to read as profound skepticism. You wish to bring another crew member into the Lattice after what happened to the Critian team? A single individual, Nathan clarified. Someone young enough to absorb genuinely new ways of thinking. Experienced enough to handle unexpected conditions. And psychologically stable enough to face death without collapsing into panic off. You're describing an exceptionally rare combination of qualities. We're describing what's necessary, Nathan replied. Because if we can't extend this capability to others, then our discovery accomplishes nothing. But if we can demonstrate the technique with a mixed species crew, prove that it isn't exclusive to human psychology, then we open vast regions of space to safe transit. The search for a suitable volunteer took 2 weeks and involved psychological screening that made military recruitment appear casual by comparison. They found their candidate in an unlikely source. A young Selene pilot named Kesh, who had been submitting applications for every dangerous assignment available in what his superiors charitably described as an exceptionally high tolerance for risk. Owen met Kesh for the first time in a briefing room aboard the council station. The Selene was younger than Owen had anticipated, his scales still carrying the vivid markings of early adulthood. his movements radiating the restless energy of someone who badly wanted to prove what he was capable of. "Do you understand what you're volunteering for?" Owen asked. Kesh's translator rendered his response in level, unornamented tones that stood in sharp contrast to the animated clicking of his native speech. "I understand that you have done something everyone said was impossible. I want to learn how." "It's less about learning," Nathan said gently, "and more about unlearning. About releasing everything you currently understand about survival, danger, and the instinct for self-protection. I am willing to attempt that." "Willingness alone isn't sufficient," Kevin added. "You have to be genuinely capable of total acceptance in the actual moment. Not intellectual understanding of the concept, but real emotional embrace of whatever occurs." Kesh was quiet for a moment, his scales moving through patterns Owen's cultural briefing identified as deep contemplation. "My people have a saying, 'The river flows whether you push against it or move with it.' I believe I understand what you're asking of me." "Intellectually, yes," Nathan agreed. "But when the Latis is dismantling reality around you, and every survival instinct you have is screaming at you to fight or escape, intellectual understanding becomes worthless, unless it's anchored in something deeper than thought." They spent 3 days preparing Kesh for the crossing, not by teaching him methods or techniques, but by helping him locate within himself the capacity for radical acceptance that had carried the humans through. It was difficult work, attempting to communicate something that lived more in the realm of emotion than logic, more in instinct than strategy. But Kesh proved to be a genuinely exceptional student. He listened with authentic curiosity, rather than defensive skepticism. He asked questions that demonstrated he was reaching for the why beneath the what. By the 3rd day, Owen thought he could perceive something shifting in the young Sleen's manner. A settled, open readiness that suggested the lessons were taking root somewhere deeper than his conscious mind. "I think he's prepared," Nathan announced on the evening of the 3rd day. "You think?" Owen asked. "That's not exactly a ringing endorsement. There's no certainty until we're inside," Nathan replied. "But I believe he has the right foundation. Whether he can hold it under genuine pressure is what we'll learn." The lucky fool departed the council station the following morning with a crew of 4 instead of 3. Kesh had insisted on bringing almost nothing, having understood that the mission was as much about the interior state as the exterior preparation. As they approached the lattice boundary for the 2nd time, Owen felt his earlier apprehension return, sharpened now by the weight of responsibility for keeping their Sleen passenger alive. "Remember," Nathan said as the shimmer of space filled their view screen, "whatever happens, don't fight. Don't try to protect Kesh, or yourself, or the ship. Just accept." "Accept," Kesh repeated, his translator carrying an odd resonance in the single word. "The river flows." They crossed the boundary at 13:22 hours station time. This time Owen knew what to expect. The sensation of the ship reshaping around them, the impossible visions of other times and locations, the vast pressing awareness of something colossal examining their intentions. He let all of it move through him, held their course through spaces that had no business existing, and tried not to monitor whether Kesh was managing the same discipline. Beside him he could hear the Sleen's breathing. Rapid at first, then gradually slowing as he worked to overcome the biological imperative of fear. Owen wanted to offer words of encouragement, but understood that any attempt to communicate might fracture the fragile mental equilibrium that was keeping them all intact. The journey through felt longer this time, though Owen couldn't determine whether that was reality or perception. They moved through corridors of twisted illumination, past echoes of vessels that had perished here, following a route his instruments traced with impossible accuracy. Then, as before, they broke into normal space. Owen gasped, registered once again that he'd been holding his breath, and reminded his lungs of their proper purpose. Kevin was checking systems with visibly unsteady hands. Nathan was already plotting their position relative to the exit coordinates, and Kesh was laughing. The sound came through his translator as something resembling human laughter, but carrying harmonics that belonged to an entirely different emotional architecture. Yet there was joy in it, unmistakable and profound. "We survived," Kesh said, his scales cycling through patterns Owen's briefing identified as intense delight mixed with incredulity. "We swam with the river, and it carried us through." "You did well," Nathan said, and the genuine respect in his voice was audible. "How do you feel?" Like I have witnessed something that was never intended to be witnessed, Kesh replied. Like I understand now why all the others died. They fought, they resisted. They attempted to impose their will on something that cannot be opposed by will alone, but you didn't. I thought about my death, Kesh said quietly. I imagined dissolving in there, or being frozen or torn apart piece by piece. And I found that what I felt was curiosity, not fear, not resignation, simply curiosity about what form my end would take. And once I allowed that curiosity to replace the fear, once I stopped working to prevent what might be inevitable, the Latis stopped trying to destroy me. Owen sat with that for a moment. They had just witnessed something far more significant than another successful crossing. They had confirmed that their technique was teachable, reproducible, not restricted to human psychology or human courage. The river flows, whether you push against it or move with it. The implications were staggering. The Council's response to their second success was immediate and comprehensive. Within days, training protocols were being developed from their documented experiences. Psychological evaluation criteria were established to identify individuals with the necessary mental capacity. Plans were drafted for regular crossings, for establishing waypoints within the lattice itself, for transforming what had been an impassable barrier into a functional navigational shortcut, connecting distant regions of space. But even as the wider galaxy celebrated what the news networks were labeling the human solution to the Void Latis problem, Owen found himself troubled by questions that no one else seemed to be asking. Why did the lattice exist at all? What purpose did it serve? And most troubling of all, what were they actually traveling through when they crossed from one side to the other? He raised these concerns during a private conversation with Nathan and Kevin 3 days after their successful crossing with Kesh. I keep returning to what we experienced in there, Owen said. The echoes of destroyed ships, the impossible vistas, the sensation of the lattice examining us. It felt less like passing through an anomaly and more like being evaluated. Evaluated for what? Kevin asked. That's precisely what troubles me. What if the lattice isn't a natural phenomenon? What if it's deliberate? A test or a filter of some kind? Nathan was silent for a long moment, staring at his hands. I've had similar thoughts, he admitted. The precision with which it responds to intent, the way it eliminated every crew that approached incorrectly. It's almost surgical. Purposeful. So what do we do with that? We pay attention, Nathan said. We document everything. We watch for patterns and work toward understanding what we've genuinely found here. But we don't panic. And we don't prevent people from using the crossing. Because even if it is some kind of test, we've demonstrated we can pass it. And if passing it exposes us to something worse. Nathan offered that familiar expression of a man who operated on the conviction that any problem could be resolved through the correct application of human persistence. Then we'll address that when we reach it. Over the following weeks, more vessels successfully crossed the lattice using the methods they had developed. Not every attempt succeeded. Several crews still failed, their fear proving too deeply rooted, or their acceptance too intellectual to hold under real pressure. But the success rate climbed from 0 to nearly 40%, and with each successful crossing, humanity's standing as the species that accomplished the impossible continued to grow. It was Ambassador Thelkin who first identified the pattern in the failures. He convened a meeting with the human team 5 weeks after their initial success, his expression carrying the particular quality Owen had learned to recognize as troubled uncertainty. We've been analyzing the failed crossings, the ambassador said without preamble, searching for commonalities that might improve our success rate. What we found is concerning. What kind of concerning? Nathan asked. Thelkin brought up a series of graphs displaying timeline data from every attempted crossing. Every failed attempt has occurred exactly 72 hours after a successful crossing by the same species, as though the lattice is learning, adapting. Closing a door after a specific number of individuals from each species have passed through. Owen felt something cold settle in his stomach. You're saying it's deliberately limiting how many of each species can cross. I'm saying the data indicates a pattern of deliberate filtering, Thelkin replied. 3 successful human crossings. The 4th attempt, 73 hours after the 3rd failed. 2 Selene crossings following Kesh's success. A 3rd attempt, exactly 72 hours later, failed. The pattern holds consistently across every species that has attempted multiple crossings. Kevin was already pulling the data onto his own display, his fingers moving rapidly. He's right. The mathematical precision is beyond coincidence. It functions like a quota system. A quota for what purpose? Nathan asked, though Owen could hear in his voice that he already suspected the answer. Unknown, Thelkin said. But if I were to speculate based on the evidence, I would suggest the Latis is selecting, choosing which individuals may pass based on criteria we don't fully understand. And once a sufficient number from each species have crossed, it begins denying entry to others. How many have crossed in total? Owen asked. Thelkin's throat sacs pulsed slowly. Across all species, approximately 300 individuals. A statistically negligible number compared to the billions who might wish to use the passage, Nathan said quietly, but significant if the purpose is to select representatives of 300 individuals, Owen said. Diverse species backgrounds, all of them having demonstrated the capacity for radical acceptance in the face of the unknown. The implications hung in the air between them with the weight of something physical. If the Latis was selecting individuals based on psychological characteristics, if it was deliberately limiting passage to those who met specific internal criteria, then it was not a navigational shortcut at all. It was a filter, a test, a selection process for something that none of them had yet considered. We need to go back inside, Owen said abruptly. Back in? Thelkin's scales shifted through patterns of concern. You've crossed twice successfully. According to the pattern, a third attempt will fail. Probably, Owen finished. But that's exactly what we need to experience. We need to understand what the Latis does when it rejects someone. What the failure actually consists of. Because right now we're celebrating a discovery we don't actually understand. We're operating completely blind. Nathan looked at him with an expression that might have been respect or might have been genuine alarm. You understand you're volunteering for what could be a fatal mission. Everyone keeps calling things fatal missions, Owen replied. Crossing the Latis the first time was called a fatal mission. That worked out reasonably well, didn't it? The first time we had no knowledge of what we were entering, Kevin pointed out. This time we would be deliberately provoking something that has killed thousands. That's a categorically different situation. It's necessary, Owen said firmly, because if we don't understand what the Latis truly is, what it's truly doing, then we're stumbling forward into something that could be far more dangerous than a simple spatial hazard. The debate continued for hours. But Owen's logic ultimately proved difficult to argue against. They needed to understand the Latis's genuine nature, and the only way to achieve that was to experience its rejection protocols from the inside. The Council authorized the mission with extreme reluctance, over the vocal objections of several delegates, who argued that deliberately provoking an anomaly responsible for thousands of deaths was, at minimum, deeply irresponsible. But humanity's track record had accumulated enough political standing to carry the vote. 3 days later, the lucky fool was once again preparing for departure. This time, they took precautions of a different kind. The shuttle was fitted with advanced sensor arrays designed to capture every measurable data point during their expected failure. They wore biometric monitors that would track their physical and psychological states through whatever followed, and they established deadman protocols that would automatically transmit all collected data if the crew failed to check in after a specified interval. This feels different, Kevin observed as they approached the boundary. First crossing, we were frightened but hopeful. Second crossing with Kesh, we were confident. This time we're going in knowing we're probably going to die, Owen finished. Yes, it feels different because it is different. Nathan appeared, surprisingly, to be the calmest of the three. Whatever happens in there, remember we are not attempting to survive this time. We're attempting to learn, stay observant, record everything you can. And if this is the end, he paused. We've had a good run. They crossed the boundary at 09:34 hours station time. The difference was immediate and absolute. Where before the Latis had felt curious, almost welcoming in its alien incomprehensibility, now it felt actively hostile. The ship didn't transform gradually. It was dismantled, torn at by forces that wanted to understand its components by separating them. Owen felt the controls resist him, systems failing in sequence as something vast and utterly implacable, examined their vessel with the dispassionate focus of a mind that has no category for mercy. Stay calm, Nathan managed, though his voice carried strain. Don't fight back, just observe. But calm was a theoretical concept when reality itself was refusing your presence. Owen felt his body beginning to dissolve at its edges, his consciousness fracturing into fragments that couldn't quite recall how to cohere. Beside him, Kevin was experiencing the same dissolution, his form becoming translucent, insubstantial. And through all of it, Owen could feel the lattice examining them with a precision that was nothing short of terrifying. It was searching for something specific, some quality or characteristic they no longer possessed. They had been accepted twice before. Now they were being rejected. And the rejection had the quality of something deeply, profoundly personal. Owen attempted to maintain his scientific detachment, to observe and document as he had promised. But it was difficult to reason clearly when your component atoms were being gently but firmly separated from one another, when time had become something negotiable, and space was folding inward in configurations that made rational thought feel like trying to grip smoke. Then he saw the echoes of the previous failed expeditions. Not as external visions this time, but as memories he somehow shared. He experienced the Critian science team's terror as they understood they were dying. He felt the rage of Altarian military crews as they fought back and were systematically dismantled for their aggression. He lived through 1,000 deaths in the space between 2 heartbeats, each one teaching him something new about what it meant to fail the lattice's examinations. And then, at the precise moment when dissolution felt certain and final, something changed. The lattice paused. Owen felt its attention shift, focusing not on what they had been when they entered, but on what they had become through the process of being rejected. They were dying, yes, but they were dying while attempting to understand. They were being destroyed, but they were meeting that destruction with curiosity rather than terror. They were, in other words, still passing the test even as they failed it. The dissolution reversed itself with shocking abruptness. Owen felt his consciousness snapping back into coherence, his body remembering how to be solid. The ship's systems came back online one by one, and the hostile pressure of the lattice became, without transition or warning, something entirely different, an invitation, not to pass through as they had done before, but to go deeper, to find what existed at the heart of the anomaly, the origin of its testing, the purpose behind its existence. Is anyone else receiving this? Owen managed. Yes, Kevin breathed. It's showing us something. A path. Not just a path, Nathan said, and Owen had never heard that particular quality in his voice before. A destination. Owen's instruments displayed readings that exceeded the boundaries of conventional physics. There was something at the center of the lattice, something that existed in more dimensions than the 3 they normally inhabited, something simultaneously infinitely distant and immediately present, something that was waiting. Do we follow it? Owen asked. We came here to understand, Nathan replied. I don't think we have another option. Owen adjusted their heading, following the path the lattice was offering them. The journey felt less like moving through space, and more like descending through successive layers of reality itself. Each layer stripped away another comfortable assumption about how the universe functioned, revealing something stranger and more profound beneath it. They descended through spaces where cause and effect had been demoted to suggestions. They passed through dimensions where time moved in multiple directions. Simultaneously, they witnessed geometries that could only exist as abstract mathematics, made manifest through something other than physics. And at the center of it all, they found the source. It was not a vessel, not a device, not any form of technological construction. It was a being, or perhaps an assembly of beings merged into something singular. A consciousness so immense that the lattice itself appeared to be nothing more than a sensory extension, a means of reaching outward into the space that smaller minds inhabited. Owen attempted to comprehend what he was perceiving, and found his mind retreating from the scale of it. This entity had existed longer than his species. It had observed civilizations emerge and collapse, had watched stars ignite and burn out, had witnessed the slow flowering of intelligence across the galaxy, across timescales that made human history look like a single breath. And it had been testing, selecting, choosing. The being communicated not through language but through pure concept, ideas that arrived directly in Owen's consciousness with a clarity that bypassed every linguistic intermediary. You return. We wanted to understand, Nathan said, speaking for all of them. We wanted to know what you are. I am the threshold. I am the passage between what exists and what might exist. I am the examination that determines readiness. Readiness for what? Owen asked Ascension. Evolution. Transformation into something beyond what you currently are. The being showed them visions then. What lay beyond the lattice, for those who completed its examinations? Species that had transcended physical form entirely. Consciousnesses navigating between dimensions without vessels, intelligences that had moved past the constraints of matter and energy. But the passage to that existence was narrow and unforgiving. Only those who could genuinely release their need for control, their attachment to physical reality, their terror of dissolution, only they could make the transition without being destroyed by it. The lattice was a filter, precisely as they had suspected. But it was not filtering arbitrarily or with cruelty. It was filtering because the transformation it offered would annihilate anyone who was not genuinely prepared for it. The failed expeditions had not been murdered. They had destroyed themselves by resisting something that required absolute surrender. The 300 individuals who crossed successfully, Kevin said slowly, what happens to them? They have been marked. When they are ready, when their species is ready, they will be called to complete the transformation. They will become the bridges between what you are and what you might become. And if we refuse, Nathan asked, if we decide we don't want this transformation, then you remain as you are. The choice has always been yours. I do not compel evolution. I provide the opportunity for those capable of accepting it. Owen felt the weight of what they had discovered settle over him like something immense. The Void Latis was not a navigational hazard or a cosmic anomaly. It was a chrysalis, a transition point between states of existence so fundamentally different from each other that most minds couldn't even begin to conceive of the distance between them. And humanity had stumbled into it by accident, succeeding where others had failed, because their particular combination of stubborn curiosity and hard-won adaptability happened to align precisely with what the threshold required. Why reveal this to us now? Owen asked. Why show us the truth, when you could have allowed us to continue using the crossing without understanding it? Because you chose to return, knowing you would likely not survive it. Because you placed understanding above survival. Because you demonstrated the capacity for curiosity in the face of dissolution, which is the foundational requirement for what lies ahead. The being paused. Owen felt its attention focusing on them with an intensity that made his consciousness ache. And because your species is approaching a choice point. A moment where your path divides between remaining as you are and becoming something more. You deserve to understand what that choice involves. What choice? Nathan asked. War is coming to your galaxy. Forces from beyond will arrive seeking to harvest intelligent life, to extract consciousness from physical form for purposes you would find abhorrent. Your kind will have to decide whether to resist as you are, limited, vulnerable, mortal, or to accept transformation into something with the capacity to withstand what is coming. The revelation struck Owen like a physical impact. Everything they had endured, everything they had discovered, had been preparation for something vastly larger and more terrible than they had conceived. When? Kevin asked, his voice barely audible soon. Perhaps within your lifetimes. Perhaps within your children's. Time is fluid at these scales. But the harvest is coming, and when it arrives, only those who have evolved beyond physical limitation will be able to resist it. So we have no real choice, Owen said, and he heard the bitterness in his own voice. Transform or die. You always have a choice. But some choices are more survivable than others. The being began to withdraw, pulling its consciousness back from direct contact with theirs. But before it fully departed, it left them with one final gift: complete knowledge of the lattice's nature, perfect understanding of how to teach others to cross, and the terrible awareness of exactly what they were preparing their species to face. Ungolo. The lucky fool was released from the lattice's heart with gentle finality, emerging into normal space precisely where they had entered. The chronometers showed that 6 hours had elapsed, though Owen's subjective experience suggested it had been simultaneously much longer and much shorter than that. They drifted without speaking for long minutes, each of them processing the magnitude of what they had learned. They hadn't simply discovered a shortcut through space. They had stumbled upon the next stage of galactic evolution, a transformation so profound that most species couldn't survive even the attempt, and they had been chosen to carry that knowledge back to their people. We have to tell the council, Kevin said at last. They need to know what's coming. They won't believe us, Owen replied. How do you even begin to explain something like that? By the way, there's an ancient intelligence at the center of the lattice that's been preparing our species for a war against extra-dimensional harvesters. Then we show them the data, Nathan said. We have sensor logs, biometric readings, everything we recorded during the encounter. Let the evidence carry the argument, and if it still isn't enough. Nathan was quiet for a moment, staring at the lattice boundary as if he could see through it to the impossible consciousness that waited at its core. Then we prepare anyway, he said, because whether they believe us or not doesn't change what's coming. The harvest will arrive regardless of what the council decides to believe. At least now we have the possibility of being ready for it. Honhongro. Undergro. The return journey to the council station felt longer than any transit they had previously made. They transmitted their initial findings as they traveled, using careful scientific language that documented their encounter without fully capturing its significance. The response from council researchers was entirely predictable. Deep skepticism, paired with demands for more data, more evidence, more verification of claims that defied every established model of reality. By the time they docked at the station, a full scientific review board had been assembled to evaluate their account. The examination that followed made their earlier debriefings seem casual. Every statement was challenged. Every piece of data was scrutinized from multiple angles. Every conclusion was subjected to the most rigorous interrogation that 6 different scientific traditions could collectively devise. But the evidence was ultimately undeniable. Their sensor logs contained readings that physics had no framework to explain. Their biometric data recorded neurological states that exceeded current understanding of consciousness. And most compelling of all, they had returned from an encounter that by all known parameters should have killed them, carrying knowledge that was immediately verifiable, accurate predictions about the lattice's behavior that could be tested and confirmed within days. The scientific community spent 3 weeks attempting to disprove their findings before reluctantly conceding that something genuinely significant had occurred. The political consequences took considerably longer to absorb. How did you inform a galaxy that everything they understood about reality was incomplete? That they were being prepared for a conflict they hadn't known was approaching? Ambassador Thelkan convened a private meeting with the human team 4 weeks after their return. The council has reviewed your findings, he said, his throat sacs moving in patterns that communicated deep unease. And while many delegates remain skeptical of your interpretations, none can dismiss the raw data. Something exists at the heart of the Latis, something intelligent and purposeful. And the warning about the harvest? Nathan asked. Thelkan's expression shifted. That information has been classified at the highest levels. The council is not prepared to restructure galactic policy based on predictions from an entity whose motivations we cannot fully evaluate, so they're simply going to ignore it. No, Thelkan said carefully. But neither are they prepared to transform the foundations of interstellar governance based on a warning, with an uncertain timeline, and a source that remains fundamentally unverified. He paused. However, Owen prompted, certain preparations are being quietly authorized. Research into the transformation process, training programs for individuals who demonstrate the psychological capacity for Lattice passage, strategic contingency planning for scenarios involving unconventional threats. SICE. They're hedging, Kevin observed. They're doing what careful leaders do when confronted with warnings they cannot fully verify but dare not entirely disregard, Thelkan replied. They prepare for the worst while maintaining hope for the best. It wasn't ideal, but Owen supposed it was better than nothing. At least some groundwork was being laid. If and when the harvest arrived, they wouldn't be approaching it completely unprepared. The lucky fool remained docked at the council station for another 2 weeks while final reports were filed and formal recommendations drafted. During that time, Owen found himself unable to shake the sensation of standing at the edge of something vast and irreversible. The galaxy was transforming in ways that most of its inhabitants couldn't yet perceive, and they were somehow positioned at the center of that change. It was Nathan who finally gave the feeling words during one of their evening conversations. We've become guides, he said quietly. Whether we chose that or not, we're the ones who understand how to cross the threshold. That makes us responsible for helping others navigate that choice when the moment comes. I'm not sure I want that responsibility, Owen admitted. Neither am I, Nathan replied, but I don't think we're in a position to decline it. We've seen what's coming, we know what's at stake. That knowledge creates obligations. Kevin nodded slowly. So what do we do now? Nathan smiled. that familiar expression of someone who had just accepted an impossible task and was already working out how to approach it. We do what humans do best. We prepare, we adapt, and we make certain that when the harvest arrives, we're ready to demonstrate exactly what happens when you attempt to prey on a species that survived the Void Latis. They departed the council station 3 days later with a new contract, officially described as ongoing consultation regarding Lattice navigation protocols, but which amounted in practice to a blank authorization to continue their research wherever it led. The council wanted their expertise available and accessible, and was prepared to pay generously for the privilege. As the lucky fool pulled away from the station, Owen found himself looking back at the lattice boundary, visible in the middle distance. Somewhere inside that impossible shimmer, at the heart of twisted space and physics that had been demoted to suggestion, an ancient consciousness waited with patience that made human concepts of time feel trivial, waiting for the galaxy to grow into something capable of surviving what was coming. Owen realized, with a clarity that was equal parts terror and exhilaration, that they had just taken the first steps on a journey that would alter everything their species understood about what existence itself could mean. The comm panel chimed. Owen glanced at the sender identification and felt his breath stop. It was from Kesh. You need to see this. 14 more Selene have successfully crossed, but something is different. They are reporting changes. Physical changes. Evolution is beginning. Owen shared the message with Nathan and Kevin, watching as the implications settled over their faces. It's starting, Kevin whispered. The transformation, sooner than we expected. Nathan's expression was unreadable. Then we need to move faster. If the evolution has already begun, the harvest won't be far behind. Owen brought up the star charts, plotting routes toward human space and the systems beyond it. Where do we go first? Nathan was quiet for a long moment, staring at the endless possibilities spread across their displays. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of something that had shifted permanently and couldn't be shifted back. We go home, he said. We warn our people, and then we start teaching everyone who will listen how to survive what's coming. The lucky fool turned toward Earth, carrying 3 humans who had accidentally uncovered the secret of galactic evolution and inherited the burden that came with knowing it. Behind them, the Void Lattis pulsed with light that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously. And at its heart, an ancient intelligence observed what it had set in motion with an expression that had no equivalent in any physical form. The selection was proceeding according to plan, the harvest was coming. And humanity, stubborn, curious, impossibly adaptable humanity, had just been given everything they would need to survive it, if they were willing to pay the price of transformation.